In today's episode, I'm talking to Matt Poole. Matt's mother is from Liverpool. Her first husband was in the RAF, serving in Burma when he was shot down over Rangoon. In trying to find out what happened that night, Matt was introduced to Bill Kirkness, who served in the same squadron. Bill had written a memoir of his wartime experience. Though Bill has now sadly passed away, Matt has edited and expanded upon the manuscript, turning it into the book RAF Liberators over Burma, Flying with 159 Squadron. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing Bill Kirkness's war, the RAF in Burma, and Matt's journey of piecing the story together. But before we get started, I thought I'd just like to make you aware of the great extra podcasts I've been able to make available this year. It started with me asking Bob Forsick the counterfactual question of if France could have carried on the fight from North Africa in 1940. It's a great extra 30 minutes of discussion, and you can find it at patreon.com/WW2podcast, and it's available for patrons of the podcast. After speaking to Bob, I talked to Patrick about the Luftwaffe in Europe. Many of the topics overlap, so I thought I'd ask him about Bob's ideas on what might have happened if the British had sent more planes to France to wear down the Luftwaffe, while the battle for France was still raging. Not only did we discuss that, but Patrick went into more detail on how the Germans tracked pilot kill scores. That's also an extra 30 minutes of discussion. By becoming a patron of the podcast, you can get access to these extras. I don't do them every month, but I do try to give something back to those who help me produce the podcast by making a small contribution of $1 or so each month. So to become a patron of the show, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast. And I thank those who already give their support. So on to the main feature. Matt, welcome to the podcast. I wondered if our very start point is with Bill Kirkness is, how did he get into the RAF? Why the RAF?
He was a member of the Leeds Model Building Club. So he built airplanes. You can imagine young kids back then looking up and seeing planes and reading all the stories of daring do in World War I. And then he'd go to air shows and see planes. I don't know if he went up in a ride. I know one of my other connections took his first plane ride and fell in love with flight. But Bill was in the Air Cadets and he built model airplanes. So he had it on his mind. Boom. When he turned 18, he joined the Royal Air Force in 1940 with a young kid's desire to serve his country and fly. All the excitement of flight. Forget the fact that he might die. Forget the tragic part of war. To a young kid, it's opportunity and adventure.
Is he trained as a radio operator and a gunner, or is it a gunner and then a radio operator? Was that luck of the draw, or does he choose?
He was too small. He wanted to be a pilot, but he was too short. So they offered him a chance to go to wireless school. And back then it was wireless operator, air gunner. So it was a dual training. And he joined up in Leeds with Arnie Bridgman, who was his crewmate in the Far East. They joined up the same day in Leeds, and they were both trained wireless operators in Yatesbury Signal School there. And they went to Air Gunnery School, 7 Air Gunnery School in Stormy Down, Wales, together, and learned how to shoot guns and have fun. It was an adventure. The war was a long way away for a lot of these guys, even during their training. So the adventure continued.
Well, it certainly is an adventure. I mean, I'm right in saying their first mission is to deliver the Wellington, isn't it, to Egypt?
After they had finished their main initial training, they went to an operational training unit where they formed into Wellington crews. The first time they came together on a crew. And Arnie was on one crew, Bill was on another. And it was during the siege of Malta and the action in North Africa. They needed planes. So you are going to ferry a plane and then we'll get you back to the UK. Bill did that and had to end up in Gibraltar and then Malta, where the plane was bombed and destroyed almost immediately.
That's on the ground, isn't it, in a German raid?
Yeah, on the ground. And they watched air raids. Bill and his crew watched from the ground these air raids on Valletta Harbor in Malta. And again, it's fascinating. Imagine looking up at the sky. I've never had anything like this. You know, the Battle of Britain, looking up and seeing contrails in action. And it's surreal and beautiful in its own right, I'm sure.
What struck me about Malta is it's under heavy attack, and yet those as a crew, sort of, their plane's bombed. So they essentially have nothing to do until another plane comes available. So they're kind of almost like observers of everything going on around them. And it's, of course, high danger, but it's kind of strange because they're at a loose end sort of thing.
Because the plane they were supposed to deliver to Egypt was destroyed, what could they do? They were told, okay, we're going to put you to use the best way we can on different trades, helping out. Until we get you a plane, you're stuck here. And we're expecting an invasion. You know, they did what they could. And Bill, who was wireless operator, air gunner, one day they said, okay, there's a thing called a turret order. Gunners have to go out to the Wellington, or you do, and Bill was one of them. And during an attack, we start up an engine, and then the turret would be used to fight off attacking Germans, which was the dumbest thing because plane with a propeller spinning is going to be under attack in no time. And that's what happened. And Bill fended off an attack, but in another plane nearby, the poor air gunner was killed. That order was thrown out almost immediately. End of stupidity there. But these guys were used until a bitzer was prepared. From bits and pieces, a plane was pulled together, and then they had to fly onward in a piece of junk. And it wasn't a happy crew. It didn't always work that way. You're thrown together. It doesn't mean you're going to be a successful crew. And the skipper said, okay, we have to take this plane up on an air test. Nobody report problems. We want to get out of here. And they did. And the intercom failed to Bill's front turret where he was. And one of the two Brownings in his turret didn't work. So keep your mouth shut. You're in the Air Force. And there is a chain of command, and the pilot is the skipper, and the skipper says, we are going, and don't create waves.
That gets them to Egypt. Now, what I couldn't understand is why their orders weren't to fly to Egypt and then stay there, but their orders actually to fly to Egypt and will bring you home.
Yeah, and they were expecting to fly back. And that's what some of the other men I've known, they took Imperial Airways flying boat across Africa to West Africa, and then they took a boat home from there. But not Bill and not Arnie, who he met up again with in Cairo from another crew. But they were sent on a sailing adventure in a converted passenger ship, and it went all the way down to South Africa.
So this first ship was a cruise liner. You say it's a sailing ship. It was actually a converted Dutch cruise liner.
Yes, and opulent. And Bill didn't have an opulent upbringing, so some of it disturbed him. It didn't sit well with him because it went too far, I think. But they had fun on the ship. There were activities to keep all these men from wasting away, sporting activities. And Bill was a goalie on a hockey team. And the Air Force was in the final against the Navy. Royal Air Force had a 1-goal lead. And Bill's going after a puck or a ball or whatever it was. And he's being held back. And he just swings his stick around and smashes a guy, an officer, in the shin, and they win the game. And the officer he's okay. He just bruised. But Bill was not taken to task for that. An officer could have thrown the book at him. The Navy guys thought, wow, look what he did. We like you. That was brave of you. And it's funny. The way Bill tells his stories, most of us can relate, can appreciate, again, this human element of going to war. A young man in a strange environment on board a ship playing hockey.
Consider his bomber command, and you forget that it's not all just about endless bombing trips to Europe. He has the most remarkable, adventurous almost start of his war with this trip to Egypt, a cruise ship back to England, stopping at South Africa. I mean, it all sounds slightly exotic.
Yeah, and then in Durban, South Africa, where it first put into port for a couple of days, they have no money. And there's a beautiful girl in a nice convertible and says, get in. Okay. And it turns out to be that the local British are trying to get men to not return, to go AWOL, and then to marry their daughters and to fight in South Africa for political reasons against the Dutch or the government.
Well, the other one when he gets back, which really made me chuckle, which somehow to me this might, I think it's so British, but you might say it's probably the same the world over. They arrive back and they're asked to produce a chit for their lost kit that was bombed in Malta.
Yeah, we don't have any kit anymore because we were bombed out. Okay. After the chit comes out, that's the proof. And then they're given new kit. It happens later to Bill. I'm jumping ahead. On his final op with 159 Squadron, when they crash land and Willie, the rear gunner, is killed, the commanding officer at Chittagong, where they crash landed, had said, leave your stuff in the plane. We have a guard on it. We're burying Willie tonight. And anyway, they get back, and it turns out that Willie's handgun and Bill's were stolen, although their money belts were not, because they had left them in the plane. But later, when Bill is at another assignment after 159 Squadron, when he's not flying ops anymore, it's finally adjudicated or whatever, and he gets called in, and he has to pay for the gun that was stolen. And the estate, the parents of Willie have to pay for his gun. This is a guy who died, who had nothing to do with the theft of his gun. Bill goes kind of crazy over it, and then somebody gives him the piece of paper and says, this is one gun that the RAF will never be paid for. And Bill is able to rip up the piece of paper. So
it's amazing, because you think the stuff must go missing all the time, but that level of paperwork to demand such a thing is it's just bureaucratic nonsense. And
there's another case. Bill had a parachute for a long time, and he had never tested it. And they're at Lynham, RAF Lynham, waiting to get a Liberator assigned to them so that they can fly to the Far East in April 43. One of the crew has been disappearing. Where did he go? And they finally suspected Loverboy was chatting up the WAFs. And they went to the parachute section, two of them, Bill and another crewman, to bring their parachutes to be tested, ostensibly, but really they were checking up on their other crewmate. And the parachute guy says, okay, you first, pull your ripcord. Everything works fine. Okay, now you, Bill. He pulls it, and it's an explosion of silk. And it turns out it had rotted away. If he had to jump from an airplane, he would have died. And the guy says, you're going to have to pay for this, something like that. And it was just a joke. He was just messing with Bill. And they said, hold on, we'll just say it was battle damage, and you won't have to pay for it. But everything was accountable, I guess. And that's sometimes absurd. Sometimes.
It is. You mentioned Liberators. They had been flying Wellingtons, and they're putting a conversion They're sent to a conversion unit. I wonder, how much difference was the Liberator to the Wellington? I guess one's, Liberator's American, Wellington's are British. I guess it's not a difference between left and right hand drive like the cars. But how much different was there? Did the crews like flying them?
I know a Liberator was heavy on the controls for a pilot. It took muscle. Compared to like the B-17 Flying Fortress, a Liberator was not an easy plane to fly. You had to work at it. I'm not sure about the Wellington. I think the Wellington was an easier plane to fly. But Liberators had more comfort. It had an ashtray for the pilot. It had more comfortable seats. It had tricycle landing gear, which meant that the Bill's wireless operator table was flat when they were on the ground and taking off until they took off at an angle. So things wouldn't roll off the table. Pencils wouldn't roll off the table. A Wellington had a direction-finding loop, a little circular thing sticking out of the top that they turn so they could get a compass fix on a radio beacon. The Liberator had some kind of radio radar. It was a later kind of technology, and they had to learn these things. Different radios, different guns. The Liberator, when used by the British, especially the earliest ones, the Mark II, they had .303 caliber pop guns, and so did the Wellington. But the gun positions were different. The plug-ins for their headphones, etc. It was different. So it's a case of learning how to fly this new plane with a big bomb bay and what to do and how to communicate, how to work as a crew of 9 men. I mean, that's part of it. There are more men, so more men have to communicate without stepping on one another. That's part of the whole process of learning how to go from a twin-engine plane to a 4-engine plane that's built by a different manufacturer in a different country, different technology.
You mentioned crews there. It's this time that he gets the crew that he's going to fly to the Far East with. Now, I've heard about crew selection before, but can you give us Bill's experience of how they selected crews? Because it does always strike me as being rather random. It
was random, and that's why sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. His Wellington crew, it didn't work out so well. But the Liberator crew, when this is in July of 42, at RAF Burn at 1653 conversion unit, they're brought to a building and, okay, get in there and form crews. And they don't know one another except if they've met in the mess or their quarters. There's a lot of shy men milling around, and it was dark. I think it was a parachute building, and the lighting wasn't good. So Bill is with Arnie, the guy he joined the RAF with in 1940, his mate, and they're already going to be on the same crew. Arnie, although he was trained as a wireless operator, he wanted to be a gunner. And Bill wanted to be a wireless operator. So, boom, there's a wireless operator and gunner. They needed to find a pilot, a second pilot, navigator, and other gunners. And in their quarters, they had met a Scottish pilot who was a nice bloke, and they got on with him, and they spied him. And he's already talking to another pilot. They come over, and because of recognition, and boom, suddenly there's 4 of them. Now there's a crew that has a pilot, a co-pilot, wireless operator, and 1 gunner. And they look over at a navigator who's sitting backwards in a chair, reading a book, looking down, needing a shave, looking like he's got a chip on his shoulder. Bill's just looking at him. And he had an O brevet. And an O was an observer brevet, which meant that he was a navigator. And in the earlier training, an observer was a navigator with better training than those who just wore the N brevet, half-wing brevet. So Bill's looking at this intriguing character, and then he notices that Johnny, the pilot, John Gauntlet, recognizes this man. And when eyes meet eye, and they get together. They had flown to Malta and then to Egypt together. Johnny and the Canadian Harry Hartshorn. So boom, they already know one another. They didn't realize they were at the same location together. So they got their navigator. All they need now are 3 more gunners, and they go out to the NAFI canteen. A gunner comes up, a Londoner, and says, "Hey, are you looking for gunners?" "Yep." They end up on the crew. Just like that, they've got their crew. And they go out to dinner that night to the pub. John Gauntlet, the skipper, who really showed leadership from the start. And I knew him, and he was like this. They go out to the Friendship pub, and one by one, they have to give a little mini bio and introduce themselves. And then somebody goes off to get booze. And some of these young men had never had anything to drink before, so they have to learn how to drink. And the second pilot, the Scotsman, he had been a clarinetist in Teddy Joyce's dance band in London pre-war. He knew how to drink and how to drink whiskey. And so he brings back whiskey and he says, "Okay, everyone, down the hatch." And they come together. And the skipper, John Gauntlet, says, "Well, we have one problem. There are 3 Wills or Bills in the crew. We can't have that in case of emergency." And there was William Blue, and he was called Benny. He was the second pilot. So, okay, from now on, you're Ben or Benny. Bingo, that one's taken care of. Another guy was Cyril William Kirby. Well, some of your friends call you Willie. Some of them call you Cyril. From now on, you are Willie. And Willie was real happy. And that left Bill. Arnie said, well, Bill was called Enoch because when he gets drunk, he impersonates this character Enoch from the very popular BBC radio program called Let Me Tell You, something like that. He does the impersonation of this guy. Enoch is the name of the character, and boom, it's a great nickname, and forevermore in the RAF, Bill was Enoch. And so they could communicate on board the plane when they didn't have to give their crew position in really emergencies. It was Enoch calling, and everyone knew it was Bill. The end of their first night socializing, it was a crew. There was camaraderie. They were singing on the way back to the barracks. It's remarkable, and I've had nothing like that in my life. And I think a lot of readers will read things like that and say, wow, the horrors of war are one thing, but the camaraderie, I don't have anything to compare. This is remarkable.
I agree. It's such a remarkably random way of putting, a crew of people together. Is just throw them in a room and say, right, come out when you've got enough for a crew. And then for them all to get on, they then have to actually go out the pub and try and hopefully they do get on. It's wonderful. I'm sure that it didn't work for a number, but in this instance, it's a fantastic story. And I can't see them doing. I somehow can't see the army organising it or the Air Force organising things that way now. Let people get on with it. They either be, here's your crew, or there'd be some other psychological way of profiling people or some such thing.
The psychology. They'd look at one another and go, I don't like the way you're looking at me. You're not going to be on my crew. But that guy, I like the way he combs his hair. Okay, hey, you. How random, and it didn't quite work out 100% in Bill's crew. Ben Blue, they didn't have planes, and they were down to only 2 flying planes 2 weeks after they arrived from attrition, from crashes, and Ben hadn't been able to fly an op yet. And then the monsoon hit, and that impeded flying. So he was drinking too much, and he and Chalky White, one of the gunners, had words, and Ben pulled out a gun and shot it up in the roof. But Chalky said, "That's it, I'm out of the crew." It wasn't perfect. And these were characters. So characters, of course, in any gang, in any experience all of us have had, we bitch and moan with our buddies, and we laugh it off most of the time. But every now and then it turns, it hurts feelings, and that's the end of a friendship. And that's what happened in Bill's crew.
Now, are the tours in the Far East the same as in Northwest Europe for the crews? Durations and how did that work?
Yeah. Now, they were sent out there knowing married men 3 years, unmarried 4. So that's a prison sentence for a young man on the other side of the world in an exotic culture. Bill didn't tell his parents. He said, oh, no, I'll be back in a year, because he didn't want to cause grief. 3 years, 4 years is an eternity. When they went out there, the standard tour was 300 hours or 30 ops, whichever came first. And then when you were done with that, you would be put off of ops, doing something like teaching, imparting your wisdom on others. In other cases, like John Gauntlet, he was sent to a conversion unit in the Far East where, as a pilot who had been through a whole tour, he could take young crews up and teach them how to fly a Liberator and how to prepare for fighting the Japanese and dealing with the weather of the Far East. It was different than flying over Europe. But it was still, for the average man, a tour was still 300 hours, 30 ops, which was not set in stone. And John, at one point, said to his crew at a meeting, I've got to tell you, boys, I volunteered to add 10% to my tour, 3 ops. And it was a shock, but they all decided those who would be with him from his crew past the 30 op mark, like Bill, they volunteered to do 3 also, because they realized, man, we love this guy. We're protective of him. Nothing's going to happen to us because we're young.
Invincible.
Yeah, it happened to the other people. And Bill actually crashed. His tour ended after his 32nd op. So he would have had one more, but he didn't have to. The commanding officer said, that's it, you're done. Okay. And then he went into teaching wireless op stuff to Mosquito navigators who were mostly officers and very arrogant, and he hated it. So he had a chance to volunteer to fly again, and he jumped at it, flying with the Americans on Catalinas, the air-sea rescue. And he saw that as a much more exciting way to spend time than stuck in a classroom teaching men who didn't want to be taught, especially didn't want to be taught by a non-officer.
Flying the Catalinas, it must have been a very different duty, because hopefully you're not necessarily being shot at when you're doing rescue missions. Hopefully you're a bit safer water rather than, because they're posted to the 159th Heavy Bomber Unit when they first arrive in India, aren't they? Yeah,
they were the first British 4-engine bomber unit, and it was pure bombing and night ops.
Now, what surprises me about the units in the Middle East, or the units at that time, certainly when he's first sent out there, you know, you always think of Bomber Command on 1,000 bomber raids, and it's very much not like that in the Far East. You know, when he gets there, what is there, 6-7 planes in his squadron?
They are the sixth Liberator on 9 Squadron. Within 2 weeks, there are only 2 flying Liberators left. And they're in the middle of nowhere. And they're at the ends of the chain of command. You know, the war in Europe took precedence. So they're not getting planes immediately. And then they started trickling in. So over time, it grew into a mightier force, but it didn't compare to Europe. There were small numbers. Each mission, I added from the 159 Squadron records, I'd add the number of Liberators on the operation. And it would be, well, there are 7 planes, a new record. There are 9 planes involved, a new record. There were very small numbers.
Well, the way they used the planes was quite a surprise as well. They sort of seemed to work independently when they set off together. Does that make sense? They did. It's not as if there was a lead plane, everyone followed the lead plane, everyone followed the lead bomb aimer. They all worked to their own plan, as it were.
Yeah, well, that happened even over Europe at night. I mean, it was dark. you couldn't see other planes, so you had to fly independently. You couldn't put beacons on because then eventually the enemy would see them. And with their small numbers, they just head out to the target independent of one another. And they'd circle the target and attack. There were odds of being struck by your own bombs or colliding with your own planes. I guess it's remarkable that it rarely happened. Now, my mom's first husband, George Plank, who died on the 29th of Feb, 44, for 159 Squadron, his best mate during training, wireless operating training, Reg Payne, who's still alive. Reg flew a full tour with 50 Squadron on a Lancaster over Bomber Command. And they were struck by incendiaries dropped from a Lancaster above them. Went right through the wing. In war, it happens like that all the time, and things that are an inch away from disaster. If the bullet was a millimeter over, you'd be dead now.
I was just going to say, something else that struck me. I was just thinking, when they get down to land, when you think about Bomber Command, you think of them sort of the boys in the films going down the pubs and sinking a pint or two. But it was very much more primitive for those crews in these remote Indian air bases.
Very primitive. They were west of Calcutta, roughly 60 miles. There was nothing there. There were hamlets, native people, nothing nearby. You'd have to go take a train south into the rail town of Kharagpur to maybe go to a dance. But then they'd have to go into Calcutta for a real treat, to really go to a pub or a restaurant or a cinema. They're stuck out in the boondocks. That's part of the problem of morale for them, is you've got this horrible weather, you're bored, there are too many air crew and not enough planes. You're there, you have this prison sentence of 3 years or 4 years. You're getting Dear John letters. What do you do about it? They had their mess, and they had a little bit of liquor, but some of it was enough to take the paint off of a Liberator. It was not the best alcohol in the world. My friend Bob from Ohio, who was a gunnery leader on 159 Squadron in 43 into 44, he talked about the great beer heist where somebody saw a rail car on a siding going into Digri Airfield. They opened up the door and it was filled with beer, an Indian beer. They had a stand down and they organized themselves to just enjoy drinking beer. And there was a rule: you could not break any bottles. Everything had to be wrapped up again in the burlap and put back into the rail car because it was going to be delivered to the Americans. And that's what happened. Somewhere, you just know that somebody opened up a rail car. Yay, our beer is here. And there was nothing there. You talk about ways of turning morale around quickly. Things like that would have done wonders for morale, I'm sure. With little to do, when things like that happen, the guy you were just arguing with becomes your buddy again, more often than not. So it's fun to hear those stories.
Well, the other story that amused me was that when they got there, they discovered their tropical kit supplied in Britain wasn't fit for their climate. And
they go into Calcutta for the first time, and they start getting fit for new clothes right there in the hotel. It's like, wow, and it's cheap. As soon as they walk out into the broiling hot sun, they're sweating again, and their beautiful new clothes are already soiled. But still, they've got kit that is fit for the environment they are in. It's like men on the Russian front, Germans who had summer clothing or didn't have winter clothing at Stalingrad. It's like, oh my God. It happened because it wasn't always logical the way things worked in the military. Or in the case of some of these crews, they'd end up with no kit because it was bombed out. So they find themselves ill-prepared for the climate they're in.
Because it amused me because there was a chap I used to know who was sent to India during the war, and he told us a story about when we were boys, about how they pulled into, and I think it was Singapore Harbour, that might not be. And he said that the pith helmets they were issued by the British Army, he said they were dreadful, they were heavy, they were uncomfortable. And he said as we pulled in, all these rowing boats came out, and they and the locals would sell us English Army fake English Army pith helmets, as it were, that were better than the ones that we've been issued with. He said, so we'd buy replacement pith helmets and threw ours overboard. He said, I'm sure it was Singapore Harbour. He said, Singapore Harbour must be littered with thousands of pith helmets because everybody on our ship bought one. And he said, I'm sure everyone on every other ship travelling out there bought a pith helmet as well. So there must be thousands of ex-Army pith helmets littering the bottom of the bay.
Yeah, the photos I've seen from 159 Squadron, a lot of them are wearing pith helmets. Now, who knows? Some of them, Bill writes, some of them were eaten away by ants and termites. Occasionally, there were things like Australian bush hats came into the squadron, and they were popular because they were lighter than pith helmets. The pith helmets were broad-rimmed, so not only would they keep the sun off of you, but also the rain out of your face. And then the Aussie hats, you know what I mean? The hats, usually the Australians turned one side. They were very broad-rimmed, and they're a very practical hat for that climate. The officers let these boys be kind of bullshit. 159 Squadron was, because they were way out in the boondocks, they didn't get too many VIPs visit. So most of the photos show men without shirts on. Some of the stuffy officers in the RAF would force these men to dress up. Even ground crew working on an aircraft when it's 150 degrees inside the fuselage. Nope, you must wear a shirt. Not on 159 Squadron, not in India. And that was a blessing that they had commanding officers who understood you had to let these guys live. You had to let them breathe a little bit. So they had a reputation among themselves of being bullshit.
So what type of missions were they flying in? Well, they'd be flying over Burma.
They arrived in April 43 on 159 Squadron. Bill didn't fly his first op until mid-May, because they didn't have enough airplanes. So they had to wait their turn. But they were regular bombing ops. There just weren't many opportunities early on. And then the monsoon hit. So Bill didn't fly, his third op with the squadron until maybe his fourth, October. But once the weather stopped, the monsoon stopped, the flying picked up. And they were getting delivery of more planes. It was happening pretty fast. So the squadron was building up slowly, and the pace of flying, it picked up. But it was only bombing that they did. And one mine laying op that Bill was on, when they flew down to Mull, Maine, the Gulf of Martaban, and they dropped American-made mines. In fact, they had to fly up to the American base to pick up more mines before they took off to drop them into the waters off of Mull, Maine. And eventually 159 Squadron, after Bill was done, 159 became a mine-laying squadron, and they became famous for the longest mission of the war, bombing, not reconnaissance, but bombing, or in this case, mining. They flew all the way down to Penang off of Malaya to mine the passage, because there were ships, there were submarines, including German U-boats that were using Penang for resupplying. Bill's ops were 8, 9, 10 hours. As the war went on, the distances became greater. The Japanese were being pushed back. I can't imagine flying 9 hours on a noisy aircraft being bounced around. Most of these guys were deaf later in life, or all with hearing aids, and because those planes were loud.
And you had a pair of headset on, which you'd have to have turned up loud to hear one another anyway.
And they'd play radio. Bill would tune in to radio stations. In fact, once they were bombing Bangkok. A couple of their ops actually bombed Thailand, not Burma, but mostly it was Burma. And they're heading into Bangkok, and Bill tunes in to a station to get some tunes to listen to as they're just traversing airspace. They're getting Tommy Dorsey and all of that, and then propaganda, but then more American big band music and Artie Shaw and things like that. And they bombed the station off the air because it was in Bangkok. Bill used his the radio compass, I think it was called, and he could tell that that station was being broadcast from exactly the signal, the direction they were flying. He knew it was Bangkok, and so he bombed it off the air. And Willie, the lovable lug on their crew, Willie was kind of annoyed because he wanted to hear the music on the way home. Well, Willie just bombed them off the air.
Rangoon was their worst target to hit. I mean, what was the air defences with heavy anti-aircraft? Did you get night fighters?
Yeah, it had a night fighter presence. Compared to Europe, it was much less. And the same with the number of searchlights and the number of anti-aircraft guns. But the big towns like Rangoon were still hellholes. It was still, you had to watch yourself. The Japanese were formidable adversaries. They were able to get radar-controlled searchlights, and it would be a blue beam. And Bill and his crew were caught once, maybe twice, by the blue light. And then all the handheld searchlights could be directed where the blue one had caught the bomber. And then the anti-aircraft gunners could see what they were aiming at. And it wasn't just blindly sending anti-aircraft shells skyward. Now they could set them for an altitude and aim them. So it became dangerous. And the night fighters, there was a fighter squadron, the 64th Sentai was the most famous Japanese fighter squadron of the war. And they were based at Mingaladon Airfield, which was Rangoon's airfield, just outside of Rangoon. They'd get up at night, and sometimes it was a ploy to turn navigation lights on. And the British finally figured out, that's to get our attention. We'll report that, we'll look in that direction, and then another Japanese fighter will come in and attack from the dark. So there were tactics. Losses were few. And that's why on the 29th of February, when 2 Liberators from 159 Squadron were shot down, attacked by night fighters, it was a major loss. It just didn't happen. The last loss had been in October to enemy action, and that's when Ben Blue, flying with another crew, Ben, who had been Bill's second pilot for a long time, he was on another crew, and they took a direct hit, anti-aircraft hit. Well, that's one account that they took an anti-aircraft hit and blew up over Mingaladon. I found a propaganda newspaper in Rangoon that says Major Nishizawa destroyed the plane. So that could have been propaganda, or maybe the night fighter actually shot down the plane, or maybe the plane was damaged by an aircraft fire and then the fighter finished them off. I don't know. The point is there was defensive action, and it was formidable. So 2 planes shot down on the 29th, and then Bill's final op, they were attacked from behind by a night fighter, an Oscar, the Hayabusa, which was the Japanese Army Air Force's single-engine fighter. Same engine as a Zero, but the Zero was a Navy fighter, and there was a great rivalry among the Japanese services. So Bill's plane was almost shot down, almost, and Willie, the rear gunner, was killed. And they crash landed, and 2 other Liberators from 159 Squadron were shot up that night, also attacked from behind. And in both cases, the rear gunner was wounded. One of them crashed dramatically, and no one died. And there's a picture in the book of that amazing accident and no one died. And then the other plane made it home okay. And I found it. I couldn't put it in the book because it's my information, really. But the pilot who shot up Bill and shot up the two other planes was probably one of the two pilots who shot down my mother's first husband. Again, it's a case of researchers find things out and the puzzle gets built. Bill was credited with shooting down a plane, and he may have shot down Hiroshi Takaguchi. Or Takaguchi, the plane was damaged and he made a crash landing. The Japanese records are missing, or they were destroyed, a lot of them. So it's hard to fill in some of the gaps when it comes to the Japanese records. But they were formidable, and they were brave pilots who would fly through their own anti-aircraft fire, which is astounding. What good is it if you get blown out of the sky by your own people before you're even able to take on these bombers? Courage is measured in different ways, but they sure were brave. I knew one of them. I was able to find Bunichi Yamaguchi, a 19-kill fighter ace, who was one of the two who shot down together with Takaguchi, shot down the two Liberators on the 29th of Feb, 44.
How on earth did you track him down?
I live in the Washington, D.C. area. I went to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum and met with the deputy director, who was a 5-kill fighter ace in China for the Americans. And I told him I'd been doing some research, and I was looking to find what happened on the 29th. It was believed it was a fighter attack, but they weren't sure at the time. And this Donald Lopez put me in touch with an author who wrote a book about the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, who flew out of Burma at the very beginning of the war. So I contacted him. He put me in touch with a retired Japanese general in their air self-defense force who had been a pilot in World War II, who wrote English. I mean, it was broken English. It's funny. I couldn't write English that was so funny, but thank goodness he could write English because we could communicate. I wrote to him and asked him about Bunichi Yamaguchi, and he writes back and says, I'll be meeting him next week. Oh, and I knew who Bunichi Yamaguchi was because I'd been standing in line in Alexandria, Virginia to meet some American fighter aces, including Gabby Gabreski, a big P-47 ace. And this guy behind me was a collector, and he had a big library, and he just said, well, sometime maybe I'll give you a call, or you can come over and we can talk our interests. Okay. It's like 2 years later, I get a letter saying, I'm selling off my library and moving to Florida. Are you interested in looking at any books? I came over and I asked him, do you have any books on the air war over Burma, Japanese side of the war? Well, I have an unpublished manuscript here. Really? Yeah, it's a partial translation of a Japanese book that was never published in America. Here, you can take these photocopied pages home with you. Oh, great. And I had insomnia that night. And I remember opening it up, and it had a typed little biography of Bunichi Yamaguchi. And it said, on the 29th of February, 1944, he and Hiroshi Takaguchi attacked bombers over Rangoon. Oh, my God, this is the man. These are the men. And Takaguchi was a 9-kill ace, so his biography was in there also. So I had two names. And then I contacted the Japanese general, and he put me in touch with Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi wrote me a long letter, and he spelled the whole story out because he and Takaguchi got an award the next morning for shooting down these two bombers because it was so rare. And then when Yamaguchi died a few months later, his son gave me the award. It's just written on rice paper. It's just characters, but it spells out what happened. So this award, which I have framed, it's just an intriguing document that shows proof of a path that led to my existence. So I'm tickled by it, but it's remarkable. And that goes to the Imperial War Museum when I die. That goes.
It's a remarkable serendipitous joining of dots.
I don't know how the bigger picture happens. but I'd swear I've been dropped clues here and there. Or I'll go to the mailbox and, whoa, look at this. This solves this mystery today. And is that somebody, George and who knows, Yamaguchi, and they're all having a good laugh and saying, let's throw another clue Matt's way. Boom. I don't know. I won't get into the spirituality of it, but I laugh. When it happens, I laugh and I'm grateful for it. And I've actually jumped for joy. It's like, it's too good to be true. You can win the lottery the same way. It's just, I have a brother who's a professor of molecular biology, real smart guy. Everything to him is explained in terms of science, probability, and so forth. So you win the lottery, it's probability. It's just probability. Well, fine, but to have some of these things fall into my lap, if it's probability, I should play the lottery more often. Because my day will come.
well, good luck with that, Matt. Let's leave it there. If you want to read more about 159 Squadron in Burma and the exploits of Bill Kirkness, the book is RAF Liberators over Burma, Flying with 159 Squadron by Bill Kirkness and Matt Poole. As ever, you can find links on the website. Don't forget, if you're on Facebook, seek me out, WW2 Podcast, for more World War II podcast news, pictures and updates. For patrons of the show, head over to patreon.com/WW2 Podcast, as Matt and I are going to continue the conversation. So that's all for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.